This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with performance analyst and coach Nick Gearing. He discusses his current PhD work, focusing on isolated practice and how this is informing some of the top academies in Europe, his role in trying to close the gap between the academic and practical football setting, as well as some of his work during spells at Brentford and Leyton Orient. We are currently trying to grow our audience and want you to be part of it, so please do us a favour and share this podcast with friends and family. This will allow us to keep making episodes. I hope you enjoy. Perfect. So, Nick, this has been one of the hardest podcasts to organise, and it's been all my bad. So I apologise for that. So thanks for bearing with me. But how are things? All good your end?
Yeah, all good. Keeping very busy at the moment. But all good. Thank you.
Good. So I wanted to obviously had a conversation. We've had a chat before about some exciting work and whatnot you're doing. And then obviously seen your profile and stuff, and there's some really interesting bits on there. So if you can kind of a whistle-stop tour, talk to people, I guess, about some of your experiences and then what you're up to now, and then we'll get probing around some of the exciting stuff that you're doing, which I think will really help coaches around the world, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to cram into like a few minutes. Even just a few years has been a lot. But so starting out was my plan was always coaching long term. Never played, never was in academy or anything. But I first role was actually at Gillingham. I basically got that by sending out letters to any club that's within sort of 2 hours of where I live or lived at the time. Long story short, was an intern at Gillingham, leading the basically it was working for free for Gillingham, being in charge of analysis there. And then second season that was like turned into a paid role full time, which was really good. The club, while I was there, we had like top 2 league position finishes in like 20 years. Like that included players like John Egan, who's playing for Sheffield United at the moment, and Republic of Ireland, and Bradley Dack as well. So that was really good. I then moved to Leyton Orient, which was absolutely mad. The first year I was there, we had the ownership at the time was difficult to say the least. I went in with Andy Hessenthaler as manager, and 8 games later he had gone. And we had 5 managers that season. I was actually the only member of first team staff that stayed from day one to the last day of the season. Which, when you think about it, is crazy. And I think at this point, I'm 23 years old, and I basically during that season I was doing some academy coaching as well as being head of analysis. And I, by the end of the season, I was doing first team coaching, which was bonkers considering I went in to be an analyst, and that was it. So I then stayed on at Orient. When new ownership came in, stayed on at Orient, and the new owners had seen my coaching and basically made me first team player development coach. So work a lot around the individual side of it. Still head of analysis at that time. And left Orient, done some work part-time with Brentford as a video recruitment scout. I'm currently a teacher as well, recently qualified as a teacher, and doing a PhD at the moment. So lots of really interesting research about how academies are developing players, and like I think it's could be a huge piece of research about what comes out here about how current Champions League players have been developed. So really exciting stuff around that. And along the way as well, I own Performance Analysis UK, and I've been running that for a few years with doing courses and that sort of thing. So lots going on. Very busy. I definitely wasn't joking when I said busy at the beginning of this. All good. That's where we're up to at the moment, I think.
Perfect. So if we start with the PhD side, I guess the first question for me is what drew you to doing a PhD in the first place? What made you want to do it? And then what made you settle on the area that you've decided to investigate?
Yeah. So, I mean, really doing a PhD was like it was during COVID. I want to be back into football is my, picture of this. This is sort of where I am. want to be back into football, and you apply for jobs, and there was a role that I'd applied for at Aston Villa at the time. It was a scouting role, and got down to the interview stage, and they said to me, right, you are one of the final few. We had 500 applicants, and I was like, wow, like I've got to stand out here somehow. And basically, I looked into basically just a way of standing out. And the PhD was something that I looked into. Spoke to Dr. Matt Bridge at University of Birmingham, who basically said a PhD would be good, but they do a thing called a professional doctorate, which is a sort of encapsulates a PhD, but it's for people who are working on the applied side. So I basically spoke to Barry Just at the university as well, and that was basically my in for it. And I had a sort of a subject at the time, because everything that you see or a lot that I see on Twitter and is on my followers at the moment is there's so much about isolated practice and that in football, and how that sort of how that's being encouraged a lot of one-to-one coaching and that sort of thing. And I've been to see academy sessions at Chelsea and that sort of thing before, and the isolated practice was huge, but I kept seeing so many people tell me that it was a load of rubbish and it couldn't be used, and there was a real sort of conflict there. And I was like, my proposal was, I'm coming from this from a very much a professional side rather than an academic side, and for me, those two things have always been miles. I think they have been miles apart. I think they are in sport. And I think that's something that's starting to come closer together, and that's why we wanted to do this. So, yeah, I mean, that was my sort of angle to start with. My point was, well, if it's so rubbish, why are all these clubs doing it? And that was basically where I wanted to go with it. And that sort of progressed a little bit into. So my first study was around that, and that's sort of being written up at the moment, and will hopefully be published. But around basically just the picture of isolated practice at the moment. What are clubs doing it? Are the Chelseas who I mentioned just then? Are they doing it? What's their reasons for doing it? What are they saying about it? Because as I say, I want to get a bit more of a real life picture. I think the big thing about this was about doing the PhD was like, as I say, most studies, most academic things are right. We're going to do something now, and we're going to look to the future, and over the next 6 months we're going to measure it. And I was a little bit like, well, it's all well and good, but the Champions League and the Premier League have already got a lot of good players playing in them. Why don't we just ask the coaches how they were developed? Because the problem is when you do like a 6-month trial of research, is you don't know how it's going to end in the end. Well, we already know that Phil Foden's playing the Premier League. So why don't we just ask his coaches what he's been doing up to this stage? That way we're in the space of the time it takes to interview and observe and all of those sort of things, we're finding out about 15 years worth of information, all about his childhood and all about all these sort of things. So yeah, that was my first study, was just around isolated practice. And now I've started to, as I sort of mentioned, then branch out a little bit and just go, these players, what's creating them? So I've been interviewing lots of brilliant coaches. Basically, I got the clubs out of the top 5 leagues, as in England, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, and basically looked to see where each of those players were at the age of 16. And now I've created basically a table of who the most productive academies are from that sense. And I'm interviewing their coaches and saying, what does your sessions look like? Why do you do that? Where's that come from? So I've spoken to coaches at Ajax and Barcelona, Man City, and Man United, all clubs from all over, Sporting Lisbon, and that's exactly what I'm doing at the moment. So I'm trying to create this piece of research that will hopefully be a little bit of could be a framework in the future. That's sort of the end goal for me. I'm going to soon start to observe some of these sessions, and there's a potential of me going to Holland and looking at some sessions there about how they've worked. I've been invited over by quite a few clubs. A huge English club has been in contact about the research as well, about using it in their academy. So there's lots of really exciting things going on with it. And it's one of those things that sort of couldn't believe how it was always an idea. And I was like, can I actually see this through? Will I get these conversations that I want? And yeah, I mean, it's been incredible experiences learning about why clubs are doing things, and these coaches who have worked with these brilliant players, and sort of seeing what they've done and how maybe that could be implemented in the future at other academies.
So I'm not going to ask you, obviously, for the real intimate details, because I think, obviously, for those people that are listening to this, they can wait for the actual project and whatnot to come out. I guess from my perspective, do you see any great disparity in terms of what clubs are doing, be it in a country or across the top 5 leagues? Do you see quite a difference in what clubs are
Yeah,
delivering to their players?
yeah, I think there is. It's interesting because the main part I'm trying to do at the moment is make sure that research is across. Although we're focusing on the top 5 league players, and then we're looking at the academies they come from. Like there's a lot more that come from basically the other 4 than there is France. There are a lot of clubs who are players who are coming from Portugal who are playing in the Premier League, that sort of thing. So they're actually outside the top 5 leagues, but yeah, it's really interesting just the styles that they sort of take up in terms of the way that they want to do things. There's no secret about the way that Barcelona do things. A lot of that stuff you can sort of Google a little bit. There's Spanish clubs are a lot less inclined to look at isolated practice. Everything's more games based in what they're doing, and the things that the way they're designing sessions. And it's interesting talking about how they sort of coach technique is in a completely different way. And it's interesting because I think English clubs seem to be a lot more trendy in a way, like seeing what's going on at the moment, and they will adapt to that. Whereas Spanish clubs and Italian clubs are very much like, well, this is the way that we've done it for a long time, and they've got success from it. So there's a reason they're continuing it. Whereas I think we're seeing a big trend at the moment in England certainly is having one-to-one coaches. And that's definitely not a bad thing, and the research will probably show some potential answers to whether that's a good or bad thing. But I think, as I say, I think English clubs are a lot more sort of adaptable in that sense. They go, well, actually, what can we do now? What can we change? Whereas, as I say, speaking to the Spanish clubs, they're very much like, this is the way that we work. It's our club philosophy. This is what was set by, there's no secret of Johan Cruyff's philosophy years ago. We're continuing with that. So yeah, I think that's a big thing. I think culturally, it's hugely different. It's interesting talking to coaches who have gone between countries as well. There's a couple I spoke to that have worked in Holland and the UK as well, and they were saying like they came to England and basically said they were expecting that the players would be terrible in England technically, and they said, to be honest, that they were, in comparison to the Dutch academies, it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't of the same standard. But the focus was more on physicality at the time. At the academies that they're in, one coach really interesting. He said what I actually did was came to the UK and found out there's more than one way to win. I'm spending my life talking about this total football way of playing, and in actual fact, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you win a game when you're older. So in actual fact, the focus of developing the players maybe actually could be different in different countries, taking bits from different countries, which is again sort of the idea of the research. Can we create something that's a little bit of that, and actually could be an ideal way to develop players?
Yeah, and looping back into something you said there, you mentioned around the use of one-to-one coaches, and obviously you've had experience this in yourself. So for people that maybe aren't familiar, I know there's probably a little bit of a guess in the title, but what are one-to-one coaches and what are they actually used for and how are they used in practice?
Yeah, so I mean, when I took on the role, mine was very much I'd had a little bit of a bit of a bad experience with a manager that bear in mind at this stage, I'm proposing this role to the director of football Orient, and it was like I was 23 at the time, and mine was like a looking at say a manager I've worked with who basically said as soon as a player gets to 18, they should be a player, and I couldn't deal with it. Like that was my big thing was like, well, no one stops learning. It's that age old thing that everyone's always learning, and people, some coaches would treat an 18, 19-year-old the same way they would treat a 34-year-old. And I was like, well, there's development still to come there. And there are different ways of doing it. Just because you've now joined the first team doesn't mean you're going to be a complete player just because you signed your name on a piece of paper that's worth a lot of money. So for me, that role was very much like I had a group of players who were, it wasn't just me that worked one-to-one with them. It was also the assistant manager at the time was doing a lot of work with them, Ross Embleton. But basically my role was to create goals, really, like find out what did that player want to be, where did they want to get to, and how we could sort of improve that. I had a really interesting call with somebody who'd been a one-to-one coach before and had actually done some research on it, and like in the Premier League, and they were a little bit unheard of at the time, to be honest. I mean, I'm only talking like, I don't know, what was it, 6-7 years ago, but there wasn't a lot of them around, especially first team level. So that call was all about ensuring it's not negative. Basically, a one-to-one can very much seem like, you know, when you're at school and you're taken out of lesson to go and do something, you know, like improve your English, improve your maths, it can be seen as a negative because you're behind. But in actual fact, my work was all about how can we, you know, some clubs call them super strengths, how can we improve, you know, the things they're currently doing. So, you know, I would talk to, we had, at this time, it was a little bit, so we had a group of players, the club almost went bust. We literally started pre-season with, I think it was 7 players, and all of them had come from the under-18s. And we had a group of really good players. We're talking like Stephen Alzati, who's playing for Brighton at the moment, Josh Karoma, Sam Dalby, Tristan Abrahams, all these players who ended up going upwards and signing for Championship and Premier League clubs. And basically, we all knew they were really, they were very good, especially for their age. And we basically wanted to protect them a little bit and help nurture them. We didn't have an under-23s at the time. So my role would be to work with them day to day on their goals. That might be in the game situations, in like at the end of training, we'd talk about something they've just done. All the training was filmed from my work as the analyst for the team as well. And then I would put on, you know, just little individual sessions of trying to meet the things that we were doing. You know, if we're talking, I don't know, random one, we're talking like through pass, like, you know, playing at Stephen Alzati was one that I remember doing a lot of work with, he always used to get the ball between the lines, turn, and he just needed that little through pass sort of thing. And so we did a lot of work on that. And all it is to say, isolating that skill, isolating that moment, repeating it and trying to just give a little bit more of a picture in his head. So when it comes to it on Saturday, we've got a little bit more of he's got a little bit more of an idea of, you know, he might have 6,000 people watching him, but in his head, he's rehearsed the movement and the pattern that he wants to do. So that was it for me, really. And I think at the moment, we're seeing a big sort of influx of coaches that are doing more skill-based in terms of like ball mastery. Ball mastery is a big term at the moment, the one that keeps coming up in the research, that is very much ball manipulation, and it's getting the idea of a player being able to move out of situations. You know, if you give a player enough skills, enough tools, they can move out of situations. So that's something that's coming up a lot at the moment. It probably wasn't exactly what my role was at the time. But yeah, as I say, that's something that's coming out, and there's a lot of a lot more clubs are hiring these roles, because I think they're seeing the importance of, actually, while the team manager's doing his thing and he's focusing on the team, whether this be first team or under 18s or even lower down, why not have someone who can actually have those personal chats a little bit more about, you know, what are your goals? You know, one of our players at the time, Macaulay Bonn, he came into that category. We'd signed him, paid a bit of money for him, but he was he basically came into that category. You know, he's under 23 player, so he came with me, and I said to him, I remember when he first joined Orient, I said, you know, what's your goal? What do you want to do? And, you know, in not so many words, it was basically leave Orient because I want to score a load of goals and I want to go up the league. And that's exactly what he's done. You know, he's gone on, he's been playing for QPR. He's at Ipswich at the moment. You know, he's doing really well. So, and with him, it was very much like there was a lot of stories about, because so Harry Kane had been playing at Orient, been on loan at Orient, and there was a lot of stories about how he would just get a bag of balls out and he would practice the same shot over and over again, and he would continue, and he still does it now, still scores those similar goals. He would come onto his right foot from the right, come from the left onto his right foot, smash it in the bottom corner. He would just practice it over and over again. So Macaulay Bonn basically said similar thing, but I want to work on my left foot because I don't think my left foot's very good at the moment. All it was really was like facilitating that, you know, that goal really for him. And, you know, and obviously he saw improvements from it, which is what continued it. So yeah, I think that's pretty much what the role was for me. But as I say, now it's very much ball mastery. I think when you see it, I think there's a lot of, I don't know that, I don't mean to sound derogatory when I say Twitter coaches, but like there's a lot of, Twitter and Instagram will be full of coaches working one-to-one with players. And I think the problem is now, or potential problem is that there's obviously a lot of money involved in that. So where it used to be all about development, I think there's a lot of thing now that it's becoming a lot about, well, it's an easy way for a coach to earn a bit of money, and whether they're working on the right things a player needs is, that's, I don't know. But yeah.
So what does the research actually suggest in that area at this moment in time? And how's that been challenged as to what you've seen practically?
Yeah, so I mean, the research essentially says that there's no point in isolated practice. As an overall summary of it, there's so much research that there's no point in it. But the problem is all of those studies are done, and this is, I had a conversation with so slightly going off subject, but sort of staying on it at the same time. I was writing a PE curriculum a few years ago, and I had a bit of a disagreement with somebody who's academic, university, never worked in professional sport, never worked with academy players, that sort of thing. And they made a point about something, and they said, well, all the research suggests otherwise. And I said, well, has any of the research been into Chelsea? Has any of it been into all these clubs? Because for me, your research is only half done. As much as you can create some sort of sterile environment and say that isolated practice doesn't work, how do you know that? And I'm not saying it definitely does. I don't know, because I need to say do the research and actually find out. But so a lot of it is very much games-based. Research, it shows that games-based is the best way. And as you've just sort of touched on there, you're not going to get the opportunities to practice that one skill over and over again. And I think one thing that's it depends how you do the isolated practice. I think one thing that I was really keen on was it was never a stationary ball, and I tried to interfere with what was going on as well. So we would use a lot of things, some brilliant sessions. So Ross Embleton, who I mentioned, was the assistant. He'd worked at Spurs before that. He actually went on to be Orient manager a couple of years later. Came up with some brilliant things. So simple things like, like the poles that you can use in the training ground, things like that. He would lay those on the floor, or he would get anything that could be some sort of interference, smash the ball at the pole, the ball bounces up, and all of a sudden we've got that interference. We've created some sort of realistic thing. The thing that used to wind me up was when players, we would do shooting at the end of, a bit of finishing at the end of the training, and players would always shoot from the centre. How many times do you get a shot roll to you on the edge of the 18-yard box straight in the centre? Doesn't happen. And that was one thing that used to really wind me up. So adding that context to something that, as I say, when I did create this role at Orient, it was about taking the finishing practice. I didn't want to any longer just be a finishing practice of you just roll the ball and you have a shot, and we'll continue doing that, and there's a line of players and all that, because the idea is to repeat it, but you need to repeat it with some sort of variation, because there's no point, if you've had 10 shots of the same shot, by the 10th one, yeah, brilliant, but you're not going to be that set. You're not just going to be standing there during the game. You're going to be running onto it. You're going to be, the ball might bounce in a different way. Players used to hate it, but purposely serving rubbish balls to them in training, because when you're doing it, it goes into a match. I remember the first few times I did it, I had some players, experienced players, who would be like, I'd serve a ball and they'd be like, it's rubbish, and they give it back. And you say, no, what are you doing? It's not rubbish, because in the game you're not going to stop there and go, sorry, can we just do that one again? You need to actually try and replicate those things. So yeah, I think, as I say, the research at the moment is showing a lot of clubs that are doing isolated practice in many different ways. It's not all about, I think it's interesting, because so the official definition, the PILS definition of isolated practice from an academic point of view, is quite a lame one in a way. It's very much like, it's drills, and drills is the word that I think needs to be sort of come away from, because drills suggest that, as I mentioned a minute ago, we're just going to continue to do the same thing over and over again. There's going to be nothing else involved in it. I think the idea of isolated practice needs to be that we're isolating a skill, we're doing it again and again, but there's got to be some sort of context to it in terms of variation or something from that point. And I think that's something that the research is showing, that a lot of clubs are, whilst they are doing a lot of ball mastery sessions at the start of training for younger kids, those ball mastery sessions are moving around an area, because straight away you've got some sort of constraint in terms of space. You've got other people dribbling towards you, you need to actually look up. You know, if we're talking about dribbling, you actually need to look up. You need to use your turns that you're learning at those moments, rather than just, you know, you on your own in a field practicing a cross turn 10 times. There's no context to that. So I think, as I say, I think the research at the moment not showing it in a positive light, and so sort of why I wanted to do this in the first place, because clubs are saying otherwise. I think that's the important thing. That's where I want to get to the bottom of. You know, I'm not saying at this point that isolated practice is the way forward, but if clubs are saying otherwise, it needs to be investigated at least.
Yeah, and in terms of like the pathway when you've spoken to clubs, does it look different from maybe like a foundation phase with the real dots to then what they do at the first team level? Is there a point at which it switches, or what does that look like?
So one thing that's really interesting, it is a little bit of a trend that's sort of coming out of it, and this isn't something that the analysis side of it's not been done yet. It's just from the conversations that I've sort of picked up on, is that clubs are very much isolated when they're younger because they want to control the environment. They want to control what they're doing. You know, each child has a ball, dribbling around an area, or it may be dribbling around cones, like dribbling around an area. Clubs quite often have this at the start of the session. But as an overall picture, I know many clubs do it differently, but as an overall picture, clubs quite often do that sort of thing. And it gradually builds and builds and builds. And it gets to the age of about 12 or 13, when they go into the sort of youth development phase. And it's like, at this stage, we're going to steer away a little bit from isolated practice. We're going to go for games-based. And then as soon as they become under 18s and they're full-time again, at the end of the training, they start practicing their finishing. And you think, why was there that little bit in between? Why from the age of 13 to 15, 16 did we not bother with it? But as soon as they're in the first team, because they've got the time after training and that sort of thing, they'll do it. I think to answer your question, I think ball mastery is huge at the younger ages, and as it gets to that sort of 13s to 16s age, I think everything seems to become more game based in the session. You know, I'm not saying that the younger years are not games based at all, because generally the sort of picture that most clubs sort of paint is that the start of the session will start with ball mastery, because it's getting those minutes in, getting those touches in, becomes a little bit more games based during the session. Whereas sort of 13s upwards, from what I've, as I say, this isn't fully analysed or completed research yet, but from what I'm noticing at the moment, it's very much like now we're starting to be more game orientated in pretty much everything we do when we get to those sort of ages. But as I say, it's just interesting because when they get to, everyone talks about how Ronaldo and Harry Kane and all that, they do extras at the end of the session. Well, that's isolated practice. And I was talking a minute ago about how I was doing that. And it's interesting how we just sort of start off with that. Then it's all left to games based. And then in the end, clubs encourage going back to working on your finishing, working on your free kicks, working on your, those sort of things. So, I think that's pretty much where we're at with it at the moment.
Have you got any rationale to why you think that happens?
I haven't, to be honest. No, at this stage, I haven't. I think it's, I think one word that I mentioned a minute ago is quite important, like controlling. I think really controlling the environment is really important, because people see young kids and I think, there's one real belief that that chaos is really important. But I think a lot of clubs are a little bit like, well, we need to make sure they learn the skills first. We don't want to get too far into chaos. And then, as you mentioned, a little bit like you mentioned earlier, how many times does a kid get to practice things in a game situation? Do they get to practice those turns? Do they get to touch the ball so many times? Whereas if they've got a ball each, then they can do it. And I think there's a real, I think winning comes into it as well. Not necessarily, maybe winning is the wrong word, but competition. When kids get to that age of sort of 13 upwards, competition becomes it all becomes a little bit more. You're looking at the first team now, whereas before you were a kid who's in school and you're just learning the skills. But when it comes a little bit more competition, I feel like that's the sort of ages that they're like, well, we haven't got time for that anymore. We just need to get playing games, and we need to make it all, real to the game. Which I think is as I say, it seems quite a segmented sort of approach in terms of younger age controlled, and now we're going to start to now it's games.
And do you have any plans to conduct this over different sports. So for the example I've used previously is if you look at basketball, if an individual's really struggled with their 3-point shooting over one season, they will spend pretty much the entire off season going, okay, I'm going to get better at this. And listen, I know that you can replicate the shots and conditions maybe slightly easier in basketball, but there's still always going to be some level of disparity between what you're practicing to what's in a game. So do you plan on comparing it, or have you compared it to what they do in other sports and how much isolated practice maybe they do in basketball or golf or tennis or rugby or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment I haven't, and that's not something, I'd say it's not on the cards here, but just because I think there's so much to explore in football at the moment. I think the biggest problem is that a lot of people in academies know what they do, but from an academic point of view, they don't know. I mentioned earlier there's such a big split between the two that at the moment I'm fully focused on football because I'm a little bit, we need to sort of provide a bit of an answer. It won't necessarily be a final answer, but we need to provide a little bit of an answer. I spend, on Twitter and there's so many podcasts and all sorts that are trying to explain that isolated practice there's no point to it. I sort of mentioned earlier about the lecturer at the university who was saying, there's no point to it. And the problem is these people haven't been in it. So that's the big thing for me. That's why I feel like I'm between the two at the moment. I've got the football background and I've seen what clubs are doing, and I've got the academic side of it now, obviously doing the PhD. And I feel like I need to try and bridge that gap a little bit. I do genuinely feel like that. And there's not a lot of people doing it because when you're working in football, you don't have that time, to be quite honest. You don't have any time when you're working in football. So there's not many people. I was sort of fortunate that I had a bit of a kind of enforced break, if you like, from football, that I've had the time to do this, and this could be my direction back in. So yeah, at the moment, fully focused on football, but and I think that's just because football's such a big conversation. It's such a big, in terms of the way academies are planned. There's so much money in it. There's so much. You look at any academy, the funding that goes into it is millions, and a part of me is a little bit like, well, what if they're doing it wrong? Like what if they could do it better? So that's my main focus at the moment. But there's no reason that it couldn't. I think basketball's a good one that you mentioned there because there are similarities to football in the openness of the game and how hectic it is. There's so much, and the other frustrating thing is there's so much research that's a lot of research about like game representativeness and that sort of thing. But the research of a lot of this stuff is done in baseball and tennis, and how can you compare that to football? And I think that's the problem. Everybody's saying, well, no, this research has definitely said that isolated practice doesn't work, or something similar to that, or working in a similar way. Well, it's a completely different sport. You can't even compare the two. So I'm trying to build a real thing now of let's try and make some good research in football, really, that's actually involving the people who are going to use it, rather than somebody telling me who's sitting behind a desk at university that actually I did a study once and there were six students from the university who were involved in the study, and they, it didn't work for them. So why should it work for Premier League football?
Yeah, it's disparity there for sure. And before I move on and we can discuss some of the other bits of work that you've done, how open have people been in terms of helping you with this? Because I'd imagine, for clubs, one, this is a really interesting bit of research in terms of how it can challenge some of the workings, or maybe align to some of the work they do and go, well, all the research says this, but actually we've got this new bit of research which does closely aligned to what we do, and it does show that maybe there is some value to it. So how open and have people been in supporting you in this area?
I think the main thing is that a lot of the coaches, because it's historical sort of data in terms of players who are current professionals now, and we're looking at what they did, a lot of those coaches have moved on. So moved on from the club that they were at. So in actual fact, I've been quite fortunate in that sense, because it's difficult. You contact the clubs themselves, and there's not many, especially to start with. It's once the ball gets rolling, it's interesting. As I said, I mentioned I had a club who got in contact with me about using the research in their academy, and that's because they're seeing all the clubs' research that's sort of involved in it. I'm having to speak to the clubs themselves, aren't necessarily giving me any sort of answer, but if a coach has worked in that environment, they've worked. I sort of got a bit of a measure on it. As long as they've worked in that environment for a few years and they've actually seen it, they've seen different age groups, then I can actually, I can speak to them and I know that what we're talking about is factual. So there's a lot of club philosophies that have been passed on to me in terms of documents as well. So again, which are going to be brilliant for the research and trying to actually create, if I want to create a club philosophy at a lower league club or academy in future, I've got about 10 to choose from that I can pick the parts out of, which is brilliant. And that's really, I sort of mentioned earlier, like the end goal for me is getting a framework here, from it. But yeah, I think, as I say, I think to start with, a lot of people were like, oh, I don't know if the club will want me involved in that and that sort of thing, which is why part of the research, the actual coaches will remain anonymous throughout this because of that very point. The only way you can get the best research is if you're actually giving people the freedom to say what they want to say and what they've seen, without the concern that a club might pull them up on it. So there's a lot, and most have said that they want to remain anonymous. Had a really good call. He won't have any problem with me saying this. Cohen Stam at Feyenoord, so he's director of methodology, made a presentation for me and just talked me through the whole philosophy for the club and the methodology for the club and how that works from under sixes to first team. So as I say, as it's gone on, I think people have seen, you've had a Barcelona coach and Ajax coach. Now we sort of want to be interested in this as well. So it's becoming better. I think one area that I do need, I mean, if you do have any, by any chance, have any German listeners to this, I would like some German clubs. I've got a few like Stuttgart and Mainz, and Bayern Munich and Dortmund who I would basically like to interview, because that's one area or one country at the moment that I'm sort of missing out on a little bit. I want to improve what I've got there, because the Germans, again, it's a different style. We talked about earlier, different styles from different countries, and I really want to sort of see their style as well. But they seem to be one elusive country, very hard to get hold of any of the people there.
Well, I'll speak to you off air, but I might actually have someone for you. I won't say the
Brilliant.
team on thing, but I might have someone that
Brilliant.
I can pass on. So we'll catch up on about that after.
Fantastic.
So in terms of when you're at your first team role in Orient, one of the things that you mentioned was around the kind of the hectic year of having 5 managers during the season. Now, from a playing perspective as a scholar, I had the same. When I was at QPR, we went through, I think more managers than I had hot dinners at the time. How was it for you as a staff member in terms of having all these people come in? And they talk about how people interact during that first period. And, we talk about the first team manager bounce, but also I think there's a level of trying to get to know the culture of the club currently and what that looks like. How did that filter down, and what did you see maybe that some coaches did really well during that period and maybe where others struggled? And what did that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, it was interesting. It was hectic from the point of view. I sort of mentioned ownership because of basically it's fairly public now. Like, we had an owner who wanted to pick the team and an owner who wanted to put his players in, and players that he'd discovered from all the obviously some of the conversations and meetings I was in was incredible. One day I think I might write a book about it. It's definitely sort of book worthy. But yeah, so from those managers' point of view, so I went in with Andy Hessenthaler. He had been interim manager the season before, and that season we'd actually bought a load of new players. So that was very much like a fresh start. Like, I only joined the club just before the start of the season, so that was like he had sort of set his way. This is what we're going to do. But 8 games in, he left and was replaced with I actually can't remember his name, to be honest. This is how bad it was. So he was an Italian guy who had been at Sampdoria in the past. They got relegated, and he didn't speak a word of English. And honestly, so I joined the club, and say 8 games in, we've been doing all right as well. One of our players who got player of the month a couple of times, we've then been told that he wasn't allowed to play anymore. And that was a constraint put on the manager. And it was really interesting to say, being in that room, the manager was really honest with us as staff, because it was very much like it's horrible to say, but it was like an us and them. Like, we, as a group of staff, we had to sort of stick together, because the owner would come in and the players would be like, oh, he's coming in to pick the team again. And it was such an awkward thing because our manager then had to go and speak to the players on the training ground where the owner couldn't hear it and talk about the fact that, yeah, he's tried to pick the team, but I'm not going with it. And it was a really awkward situation. So, yeah, second manager came in. It was Italian, didn't speak a word of English. Really interesting concepts, though, that he brought in. Like, so we had, he had one of our coaches, I won't mention the coach, who's gone on to be very successful now, but one of the coaches there, he told him in the first couple of days that, right, you're going to be throwing coach. And this is a coach who had been like, he had played at a really good level. He had managed at a really good level, is now a coach at an incredible level. And this guy had turned up and said, you're going to be in charge of throwing, and at the time, throwing coaches are a thing now. And that, the set piece coaches are a thing now. But at the time, it felt like a little bit, especially to him, a bit of a like, sort of a derogatory thing. Like, we can't really trust you with the ball, so you're just going to have the ball in your hand. And it was a bit of, as I say, a bit of an awkward thing. So that was difficult. I mean, I think he had the shortest reign of all of them. I think he was 60-something days, this guy. Didn't learn a word of English throughout that time, which was obviously difficult. I think we had a few foreign players that's been signed. It was interesting because there was a translator there as well. There was a couple of Italian members of staff as well, and a player who could speak Italian and Spanish, I think it was. And they were all saying very different things about what the translator was saying and what the manager was saying. So it was a really odd situation. But most of the rest actually were sort of promoted from within. So the club, after this manager went, so Andy Edwards, who's now working with England under 16s, I believe. Yeah, England 16s coach, I believe. He went to the FA as out of possession coach. So he took on the reins, but he'd already been in the club. He was Andy Hester's assistant. He was one of the coaching staff that was there. So he'd already been in the club. But it's interesting because, as you sort of mentioned, I saw 5 managers turn up and go, right, this is what we're going to do now. Forget everything we've done in the past. This is what we're going to do now. This is our new way. And it was difficult because trying to get that sort of idea on board, especially when the players are well aware, I mean, supporters are well aware, players are well aware of the ownership situation. There was always that doubt in the player's mind about who actually was picking the team. Has this person been put in charge because of, and I can quite happily say that, I certainly know that from the Albert, I can't remember the Italian's name. I thought his name was Alberto.
Alberto Cavasin, I want to say it was.
Cavasin.
I've been Googling for you, by the way. That's not just very good football knowledge from me.
I was going to say, that's great knowledge. No, so the thing is, it's bad that I've actually forgotten his name. What was difficult for him was obviously the language barrier and the fact that he was chucked into this role with players who didn't speak the same language. There was only a couple of members of staff who did. And there were some really good things that I look back now and think, he was actually really trying to do something. I remember his first session was all done with the hands. Everything was using the hand, but he was trying to it's a small-sided game, and he was trying to implement his philosophy there. And it was a great insight, really. I was the first sort of foreign manager coach that I'd worked with. It was a great insight into what he was doing. And, I sort of look back now and whilst it seemed ridiculous at the time, it really did to all members of staff and all players. Genuinely players were turning around saying, like, what is going on here? Like, as the guy's going around, his translators following him and trying to tell the players exactly what he's saying. But there were so many ideas, I mentioned there about throwing. He was very much, and I think this is something that's particularly lower leagues was sort of ignored a lot, or maybe still is. But one of his first sessions was, right, there's a throw in. He just chucked the ball over at the side. He's right, there's a throw in there just inside our own half, set up for it. And he was moving all the players around about how he wanted. And all the players saying, oh, come on, as if we don't know where to stand at a throw in. And you look back now and it was ridiculous that people were actually questioning that in a way, because the things that he was talking about, the things that you hear about at the top level now, people like Jurgen Klopp, there's a lot of set piece work there about when you've got to throw in your own half, how do we organise ourselves to be able to, switch play? And that was something that he was, hugely working on. And I think a lot one thing that I did find interesting was most coaches came in and they had first session was with a tactics board, and it was, this is the way that we're going to play now. But as I mentioned, it was very difficult because of the environment at the time. When the last manager came in, and I was doing some coaching as well with the first team. So again, I say last manager came in. So sorry, it was Andy Hessenthaler to start with, who was at the club at the start of the season. Alberto Cavasin came from abroad, and then Andy Edwards was promoted into the position because he was originally assistant manager. Danny Webb was a coach at the start of the season, ended up getting up the pecking order and became manager. And by the end of the season, so Omar Rizza, who's now working at Watford as under 23 coach, started the season. I believe he was under 18. I can't remember if he was under 16. I think he was under 18's assistant is what he was at the start of the season. And by this point was first team manager. And it was, honestly, it was incredible because he basically had a touchline ban after his first game. He had a touchline, or first or second game, had a touchline ban. And we wasn't being paid at this stage as well. Like the owner said, right, well, we didn't hear from the owner. It was just, you didn't get paid this month. And it was a little bit like, okay, I think this went on for a couple of months, basically. There was a huge thing at the club, like, between the staff, do we play the game? If we don't play the game, is that the end of Leyton Orient? And there was a big thing for me, like, do I want to be part of the members of staff that ended Leyton Orient Football Club, one of London's oldest clubs, So we felt a responsibility that we've got to carry on. And he brought in, so Omar brought in Neil Fenn from, so he was over in Ireland at the time. He brought in, his first day was actually a match day. Omar had a touchline ban, and I found myself as a 23-year-old, came in at the start of the season as head of analysis. I was the face on the touchline for this away game against Cambridge. I look across, honestly, I've never known anything like it. I look across and Sean Derry's standing there, obviously now working in the Premier League, Crystal Palace. Sean Derry's standing there as like my counterpart, and I'm like, this is ridiculous, it's incredible. And I think it was just, it was difficult for the players. I think there was a lot of injuries at the end of the season when players were not being paid, and I think those, obviously those injuries were a little bit dubious because players didn't want to play. So we spent, I think Omar had about 8 games as well, and we spent most of those with basically the under 18s, the ones who went on, the Stephen Alzatis and Sam Dalbys, the ones that went on to be my core group. So yeah, it was interesting how everybody sort of tried to implement their different way, and they were very different ways. And I think the difference was then that each manager probably saw this as, this is my career here. I could actually, if I do well here, I could go on. And I think that was a big thing. Like, you see it now when there's there's an interim manager. They're like very much, we're sort of going to continue with some of the stuff that we've been doing and sort of adapt it. Whereas each manager that came in was like, right, we're going to change it because this is how I want to do things. This is how I want to present myself to the board and present myself to prospective, chairman at other clubs. So yeah, very interesting time. But new ownership came in at the end of that season, and it was different again. So Steve Davis then came in at the start of next season. He's gone on to work with Wolves since then. I think he was with the 23s, and he was very different. So he'd been working at Crewe. Dario Gradi was like his mentor there, and he was very different. He was very much, I look back at it now, and he was very much like he was like a teacher in the way that he did things, which was brilliant. I remember him throwing down cones in a formation. It sounds like such a simple thing and something people do in academies, but with first team players, he introduced things like, oh, this is our 4-4-2, or this is our, we just play 4-2-3-1 with him. Each player stand on a cone. They would be standing 5 yards apart, and they would pass the ball to each other, but he actually understood what we were trying to get out of it, the patterns that we were trying to get out of it. He used to say to me, like, there's no point in just going out onto a pitch and we're going to try and do it on a big scale if they don't actually understand the concepts in the first place. And he introduced things like something that I'd never seen at first team before. We would watch games like you do in an academy. We put like one half of the game on, 20 minutes of a game on. The attacking unit, the midfield unit, and defensive unit, goalkeepers would all sit separately with a big sheet of paper, and they would talk about their ideas about what went wrong, what went right. And that's something that I think for me was really good. That got a lot more buy-in from players. But as I say, that was sort of start the next season when we had new owners and the club was sort of developing at that stage.
I think if I'd done that, I'd always be blaming the strikers or midfielders for not recovering quick enough as a defender. He's let us down again, hasn't got hold of it. We've played it into him, hasn't got hold of it, and they've broken on us. But no, I think, the way they break it down now in units is good, and it makes you analyze it and probably remove some of the stigma around, sitting in those meetings rather than thinking I'm going to get a pelter here because I know at some point it rolls under my foot or something like that. In terms of, is there anything that springs to mind in terms of what an individual did that lost people almost straight away? Because I can imagine, and you don't have to mention names or anything in this, but I can imagine in that situation, which is highly volatile, if you come in and go, if you come in and you really lay down the law, you make a comment, you could go, right, players almost straight away go, I'm out and I'm going to last longer than you are, so good luck with me.
Yeah.
Is there any examples of that you can think of?
There were probably a lot, to be honest. Like when I look back, and it was, as I say, because a lot was owner led. I think, particularly when the Italian coach came in, I think in that first session, and this is the ridiculous thing, like sort of going back to what you just mentioned then, like you said, it's a bit more of the norm now about how analysis sessions are. From my experience of lower league coaches, that's the only one who's done that, and that's the thing. I think there was a big thing. I look back at, mentioned about Alberto a minute ago. I look back and there were things that he was doing that was actually really good. But in that first session, the moment he said, right, pick the ball up, we're not using our hands today. We're going to talk through our philosophy. And the whole training session was like a handball game. There were so many players who turned around to each other and was like, no, I can't do this. Like, and it was amazing. It was the little things like that. And the things like we're working on throw-ins. We spent half hour working on throw-ins or something like that. It was those sort of things that were, to me, it was the things that were different. And I think that's such a big challenge for coaches, because the coaches who did well, so Danny Webb did really well when he was our manager, and all of that was about, right, we're just going to bring back the old school values of what we want to do as a team, and that's what got the players to buy into it. And it was really interesting. I think at that level, obviously, I think it's very, very different as you go up the levels. And I think that's one thing for me, looking future wise. I'm very much probably maybe a little bit picky about like jobs that I would look at in the future, because I don't want to be stuck in that situation where a new manager comes in and it all changes again and that sort of thing. I'm a big fan of, I think one thing that was a really positive move for Orient was when they brought in Martin Ling as director of football, because then there was a pathway. Martin Ling was there, and Ross Embleton was brought in with Martin Ling, and he was always working the first team. Didn't matter who the manager was, he was working the first team. So it gave that little bit of continuity, if you like. Just because the manager's gone doesn't mean we've got to change the style of play. So yeah, I think that's a big thing for a club to do now. I think the days of a manager coming in and changing the philosophy and having that opportunity to lose the players early on, I think should be going. I don't think it is at all clubs, but I think it should be going because of that need now for continuity. Clubs have realised that financially it was ridiculous that every time that we changed manager, and I remember in the Danny Webb had a different style of play. He joined, he was already at the club, but he became manager around January time, if I remember rightly. So the transfer market was just open. Well, he didn't want all the same players that were there at the start of the season. So, and probably not the same style. So all of a sudden we were now looking at different players. And I think that's something that clubs need to look at, really, is that when they're employing their coaches, they're employing their players, they need to be able to link. If one player leaves or one coach leaves, the next one needs to be able to get on with them. We don't want to put ourselves in that situation where someone's going to come in and do something nuts that's going to completely offset the team, sort of thing.
And so moving on there, you've mentioned a little bit around the recruitment side. Obviously, you said about some of the recruitment scouting work that you've done and analyst wise. Can you just talk through what the process actually looks like for that, and what that actually looks like? Because I can imagine you could go and get footage from a third division game in Qatar and be looking through that for a player. So how do you actually go around, I guess, filtering down which information is useful, filtering down which players are realistic? Because if you're at Brentford at this moment in time, Messi's probably not realistic. So how do you go around, I guess, catering to that? And then what do you prepare in a report to say, I think this player is someone we should pursue moving forward?
Yeah, so I'll be a little bit careful about what I say Brentford wise, because you sign a contract when you leave about what you can and can't say in the future about their their business. But I think, yeah, I mean, to be honest, so when I was at Gillingham, I actually created basically it sounds ridiculous, but like a scouting database it sounds ridiculous that I was creating that a few years ago. Like, where has that been before? But I started that, any player that any coach, any of us went and watched, we would write a little report, and it would be trying to hit several things, and that's gone right through. Those sort of things stayed with me. So I think one thing that's really important for a club, especially now, I'm talking about director of football and having a style, is about, right, for me, first things first, create a profile for every player, every position. This is our style of play. It doesn't have to be necessarily a formation, but this is our style of play. What does our right back look like? What does our centre back look like in our dream? If this is what we're trying to create, what do they look like? And you have to stick by that. I think a huge thing for me is you have to stick by that. So you don't end up being caught in one of those traps where you have to then sell a player because the new manager's coming or something like that. What does that player look like? So no matter what manager we've got, he's still one of our players. He's still in that sense, a Leyton Orient player or a Brentford player. Brentford may change their manager in the next couple of years, but they won't need to change all their players because they will still be similar. So I think from that sort of profile, you get what comes into your report. How good are they? I'm big on a lot of clubs are doing it now. Rating, I think you need some sort of numerical part to it. I'm not huge on the data side. That's never been not because I disbelieve in it, but it's because that's not been something that I've worked with a lot. I didn't have access to that sort of thing when I was at Gillingham and Orient, and working at Brentford, that just wasn't my role. There was a data analyst there that helped suggest some of the players, and then I'll basically my role was the volume and watching the players over and over and different players to be able to determine whether they were the right player for us. So yeah, creating that sort of that report is about putting I think one big thing for me is everyone used to go on 1 to 5 systems. That 2's bad, 3's okay. Let's take out okay. Let's make somebody make a decision. Let's make a scout make a decision. Are they a 3 because they're good, or are they a 2 because they're not good enough? If you know what I mean. Like there needs to be some sort of there can't be a middle ground, because I think one thing that's really important for me and from my sort of philosophy for it is that volume is important when you're watching players. I think you can watch players. I spoke to quite a big European club, and I couldn't believe that they said to me before, yeah, if the manager suggested a player and we go and watch them twice, we could sign them off that. And I was thinking, like, for me, that's a struggle. Like, you're going to spend millions of pounds on a player that you've seen play twice. And then I'm talking like last year I had this conversation. And it was, as I say, I think volume is important for me because, I don't know, we're going to go and watch a player who's playing in, I don't know, whatever league. And we could watch him on one day. He could have an absolute worldie, best day of his life. We could watch him another day, he could have the worst day. If we'd only watched him on one of those days, we're going to see him as 2 very different players. And I think a big thing for me is, can you watch a player 5 times? If you've watched the player 5 times, you've got some sort of understanding. And I know that's a lot, but you sort of mentioned there about how you watch the players. That there's a lot of access to clubs have access to Y-Scout and many other things. Instat similar now as well, where you can watch players from pretty much any country, any club in the world, really, particularly around Europe. And that was something that was huge on for my role in Brentford, was watching players around Europe, different leagues, different markets that maybe were undiscovered, if you like. That not necessarily undiscovered, but not everyone was looking there in terms of English clubs, especially. I think that's obviously changed a lot now with the whole Brexit rules and all the rest of it. I think that's changed the way that Brentford and most Premier League clubs can now scout players. Those players who were potentially cheaper, who before, because they were playing in the Scandinavian league, well, you don't have access to them anymore, so scouting's got to change. But yeah, as I say, volume's huge for me, because if you watch a player 5 times and they've had their worldie, they've had their rubbish day, well, the other 3 are going to tell you something about them. And when you've got to that 5 times, then you can, some clubs, I know that clubs go 5 times, and if they're still good at that point, then we'll go to 10 times, like in total, and then we'll go to 15, and then we'll refer them to referring to the club, that was something that I learned from an interview with a club recently. So yeah, as I say, I think the volume's important because you've got to discover who that player is, and knowing whether they fit you depends on how you structured your report, which depends on your profile of the player. So yeah, to say there needs to be that circle, that full circle, that full link of this is our philosophy, this is the player we want, and now we actually need to make sure they're the right player by watching them enough times and knowing that he just didn't have 2 good games when we happened to turn up.
Yeah, you don't want to end up with George Weir's cousin, do you, playing for you? You don't want to have a situation like that. No, listen, we've come to the time that obviously that we'd allotted for this. So the last question for me, which is something I ask everyone, which is who's the I guess in your field, who's the best coach you've worked with or best analyst you've worked with or against, and why?
Interestingly, from an analysis point of view, I haven't worked with many because I was always lead analyst. And that's something that I actually want to improve. I want to go to a club that I can be part of a department because it's always been my ideas. And I would love to go to a place that I can implement my ideas or like suggest, have my ideas, but actually be led by something that's seen before. So really mine's from a coaching point of view. But I mean, Ross Embleton was brilliant. It was absolutely fantastic. He was so much about development. So Ross Embleton worked at Spurs with Chris Ramsey in the academy and spoke so much about the process and how everything was about development. I remember him telling me once about he was absolutely furious because there was a coach who, I think like under 15 game, who got a player to do a long throw and he was like, who's that developing? Just because he can launch the ball from there to there, who's that actually developing? And there was a real sort of emphasis then on at Spurs on that sort of thing. And he brought it to Orient. I think the big thing with Ross was that we were sort of linked in the sense that everyone says lower league football that you can't play in a certain way. You can't play total football. You can't be this team. And it used to infuriate me. And you've got as an analyst who has to stand by, and it's not my ideas are implemented on a match day. I'm going with the manager who's got a lot more experience than me. And there was so much of, but you can't do it in this league. And Ross was a real believer that you could. And he had worked at Swindon beforehand. I mean, if you get a chance to look at Swindon's promotion campaign, I can't think what the year was, but from I think they got into the playoffs a couple of years. Martin Ling was manager. Ross was there, and as assistant, I can't remember his name, but a good friend of Ross. And they played the football they played was unbelievable. And they're doing this at League Two level because he stuck with his principles and said, well, no, we can do it. Why shouldn't we improve what we're doing? So he was really good. And another one for me was Steve Davis. I think Steve Davis, so he'd been at Crewe, and everything about Crewe was development, developing the academy players into the first team. Again, they had that style of football. And he said, why not? At this stage, we went to the National League because of the madness that had sort of pursued the year before, and Steve came in as manager. He'd had a really good track record, and he basically turned up and said, "We're not just going to smash the ball," and that was what we came up against every week. A lot of weeks we were coming up against teams in non-league that was very much like direct play, and there's obviously a place for that, but it was all about physicality. And I remember at the time, I can't remember his name, but Halifax had a player who was he was genuinely about 7 foot tall, and it was that was the game. And I'll mind my language, but my best quote from my whole time in football was when we were playing away against Dagenham, and it was shambolic. And Steve Davis had been sitting on the bench, and he just came running out to the touchline. He just shouted, "Stop effing whacking it!" And that was summed up non-league football for me. And that was genuinely, that was the thing. And he stuck by his principles. We've played some unbelievable football. And he was really unfortunate because when he was at Orient, we had to start from scratch at the start of the season. We we were very short on players by the time that the transfer we could actually start playing games. So we had 2 real centre backs. We had Josh Colton, who's been brilliant around that sort of level for a long time, and George Elokobi from Wolves, and played in the Premier League and all this. So we had those 2, and in the space of 4 days, both of them got long-term injuries, and we were top of the league when they both got their injuries. And by the time they came back, from their injuries. We went on, I think it was something ridiculous, like 11 games without winning. And we were playing, I remember there's a game on TV against Hartlepool that we had like 22 shots. They'd had one shot and we lost the game 1-0. But that just kept happening. And we just didn't have that centre back part. We didn't have anything. We had a couple of like youth team players who were playing there and good players, but just not ready for that level yet. So Steve was really unlucky in that sense. And he's somebody, so Ross and Steve are two people who I would love to see manage again. And I'd love to actually just go and, I often think, if I had a season ticket for somebody's team, they're the team who I'd like to go and have a season ticket and actually just enjoy the football that they would play. So yeah, they're the two for me.
Perfect. Listen, Nick, really appreciate your time. Loads of interesting stuff. And be sure to, when your research is published, be sure to have me in and I'll put it across all my platforms so everyone's aware of it. But yeah, really appreciate your time.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.